Melbourne has lots of railway lines, stretching out in all directions from the city. But there used to be even more lines that were built over the years that never made it to the modern day. Some simply weren't profitable enough, others were unable to keep up with competition from cars. Yet there was one singular line that was so poorly built, so ill conceived, and so pointless that it serves as a prime example of how not to build a train line. This is the story of the failed Rosstown Railway. The year is 1875. The protagonist of our story is one Mr. William Murray Ross. We don't know what he looked like, so he's going to be represented by this image of an old guy from the 1800s that I found on Google Images. A wealthy British man who works for the Liverpool, London and Globe Insurance Company. He had moved to Melbourne 23 years earlier. Ross has a vision, a plan for a new suburb. Thousands of brand new homes, all situated around a grand centerpiece. Ross's gigantic sugar mill. The suburb was to be called Rosstown. The sugar mill did end up being built, much to the dismay of locals, as most of the area's water supply was redirected away from their own farms to fuel Ross's ill-fated ambitions. In order to fulfill his vision, Ross had been slowly purchasing more and more land, and by 1875 he owned nearly a fifth of the suburb of Caulfield, which was at the time mostly empty paddocks, ripe for development. The only issue is, he needed some way to convince people to live here. More specifically, he needed a way for people to get here once the developments were built. After all, no one had cars at this point. Ross was going to have to build a railway. And so, that year, Ross published an advertisement in the Argus newspaper, promising cheap housing with beautiful sea views for dwellings, and most notably, a new line of railway to be made from Elsternwick to the sugar works, to have 3 stations in this suburb. Despite this promise, Ross hadn't gotten any kind of approval to build a new railway, and there was no guarantee he would ever get approval. At this point in time, most train lines in the state were operated by the government-owned Victorian Railways, and they generally didn't want rich businessmen just going around building tracks willy-nilly. Ross's first proposal to build the line was rejected in 1876, but he wasn't going to take no for an answer. He updated his proposal to extend the line to connect with the under-construction Gippsland line, where trains would continue all the way out to Traralgon and Sale. Then he realized that the Victorian Railways would charge him insane amounts of money to run trains on the Gippsland line, so he amended his proposal again to simply have the trains end at Oakley. He submitted his proposal and was rejected once again. Undeterred, Russ invited a group of politicians to visit his estate, and they were so impressed by his giant sugar mill, which still went unused at this point, and actually was never used at any point in history, that they decided to write a report to the government recommending them to build the railway. Many other politicians remained unconvinced, however, and it took over a year for the government to finally give Ross permission to build his train line, which finally happened in October of 1878. The only issue was Ross was now broke. His unpopularity among locals made it difficult for him to convince anyone to buy property in Rosstown, and was unable to start construction. He had to sell much of his shares and holdings, and attempted to secure several bank payouts to finance construction. Time was quickly running out, and by the time 1883 rolled around, the deadline was looming. To make matters worse, a new line had opened in the time it had taken Ross to secure funding, what is today the Frankston line. Ross wanted to simply build a flat junction as this was cheap, but the VR demanded he build an overpass to avoid the potential of a collision. In the midst of this crisis, Ross was desperately trying to finish the remainder of his line. He cut as many corners as could possibly be cut. Tracks were laid on raw earth, sleepers were placed 4 meters apart instead of every 90 centimeters like they should be. Ross had to use iron rails instead of the stronger steel rails, and by the time the deadline rolled around, the conflict with the VR over the junction still hadn't been resolved, so that part of track was just missing. Despite this, Ross still declared the line fully complete in November 1883. The government was not having any of it, however, and after seeing how shoddy the work was, refused to give permission for the line to be used. The Argus, the same newspaper that he had advertised in a few years prior, released a scathing article heavily criticizing the line's construction, essentially saying that Ross would have to completely start over again to make it even slightly usable. In 1884, he managed to negotiate an agreement with the government for another 5-year extension to get the line up to standard. However, Ross was still broke, and he tried to offer up the line to the Victorian Railways several times, but they weren't having it. In 1885, he finally began the reconstruction, but was completely unable to make any substantial progress. He had to finally build the bridge carrying the Frankston line over his railway, which crippled his savings, even with the VR paying for 2/3 of the cost. When the 5-year deadline rolled around, Ross officially opened his line, despite the fact that it still wasn't complete, on the 14th of November 1888. Built using worn-out second-hand rails and sleepers, with some such sleepers not even secured to the ground properly, Ross allegedly was able to run one train down the length of the line, carrying him, his wife, and his friend Thomas Bent, who would later become Victorian Premier. This probably didn't actually happen, by the way, as the line was still very unfinished, but it's possible they were able to make it at least part of the way down the line. From this point forward, Ross would continue to fight for the completion of his railway, but to no avail. The 1890s saw a recession that led to no one wanting to buy or develop land, further reducing the opportunities for Ross to make a profit or to get anyone to invest in his fruitless endeavor. At this point, he was constantly attempting to buy and sell, starting new companies and using questionable legal loopholes to prevent himself from going bankrupt. Ross died at the age of 79 in 1904, and his land and railway were offered up for auction at a price of £20,000. His friend Thomas Bent reportedly made an offer to buy it for £17,000, but later withdrew. The sugar mill, which had fell into disrepair, was demolished in 1909. The parliamentary acts that had originally allowed Ross to build the railway were repealed in 1916, and the tracks were pulled up and sold to a railway company in Tasmania. Over time, roads and houses were built over most of the Russtown Railway's former alignment. The 4 stations, named Hawthorne Road, Buran Road, Sugar Works, and Garden Vale, no, not Garden Vale, Garden Vale, all have little to no evidence of their existence, and it's unclear if any of the station platforms were ever even built. A short section between Bamborough Road and Grange Road was turned into a linear park, which still exists to this day. The Frankston Line Bridge was rebuilt, but you can still see where the Russtown Railway used to pass under it. The suburb of Russtown was renamed Carnegie in 1909, probably because people had associated the name Russtown with, well, Ross, and I think we can agree Carnegie is a much better name for the place anyway. And so that was the story of the ill-fated Russtown Railway, one of the most idiotic urban planning disasters in Australian history. If Ross had managed its construction a bit better, I do think it could be a very useful asset today, especially in helping to relieve pressure on the now very busy line to Cranbourne, Pakenham, and out to Gippsland. But I think it's safe to say the Russtown Railway isn't coming back anytime soon. With that said, thank you for watching this video, thanks to my channel members for supporting my channel, and I'll see you in the next one.